Plan risk responses. The plan risk responses process involves creating a plan, creating options for how to respond to identified project risks. And there's some very specific terms talked about here that I am going to address. As you can see here in this table, we've got the risks, we've got the risk response approach, in this case, mitigate. We have also assigned a risk owner, someone who came up with the response, and we have a risk action owner or risk response owner, someone who will carry out the response. So Bob is the risk owner, Julian is the risk action owner, and our strategy is to mitigate the risk. So what does it mean to mitigate the risk or transfer the risk or accept the risk? Those are some of the things we're going to be taking a look at in this process. So in plan risk responses, we've got the project management plan, project documents, EEFs, and OPAs. Let's examine why we have these very briefly. The project management plan, of course, contains the, surely you remember, did you get it? Risk management plan, I hope you did. In addition to that, we also have the resource management plan and the cost baseline here. The cost baseline contains information about the contingency funding for those risks, the contingency reserves. So it's relevant here. The next one, project documents, could have lessons learned register that help us understand how a risk was responded to in a previous phase or project. We could also have the project schedule used to determine how agreed upon risk responses will be scheduled on the project. We could also have project team assignments showing resources that may be allocated as risk action owners. We also have resource calendars showing when resources are available and when they're not. This could also further help us. And we have the risk register, of course, because what we're trying to do is further analyze these risks in the risk register. We also have EEFs and OPAs that need no introduction. As usual, we need to be aware of the risk appetite and threshold of stakeholders. And under organizational process assets, there could be templates, databases, and lessons learned to consider. Let's take a look at our tools and techniques. Expert judgment, expertise to call the shots on what should be done, expertise on threat responses, opportunity responses, contingent response strategies, and overall risk strategies on the project. We need experts who know about this. The next tool and technique, data gathering. Data gathering to be able to have those interviews, to glean responses from people, to gather data. The next tool and technique is interpersonal and team skills. We need a PM who can facilitate and make stuff happen. The next one here is strategies for threats. Now, I'm going to cover this in a lot more detail in a different video, but for now, at a very high level, let's talk about some of these. The first one is escalate. If a risk is beyond the state that it can be managed, we need to escalate. It's appropriate when it's outside the scope of the project or when the response would exceed the project manager's authority level. The next one is avoid. Avoiding the risk is retreating and running away from the risk. Avoiding the risk is like cutting off part of the project to avoid the risk. Risk avoidance is used when we want to eliminate the threat. We want to make sure there's no possibility of this even happening. We call that avoid. We also have risk transfer. When we find a risk, we can transfer it to a third party. We can purchase insurance. We could use performance bonds, warranties, guarantees, and so on. The next approach to these negative risks is to mitigate the risk. This refers to reducing the probability or the impact of the risk occurring. And last but not least, we have accept. In accepting the risk, we say Yes, we know the risk could happen, but we are not going to do anything about it at this point. Now, under risk acceptance, there are two types of accept to be aware of: passive acceptance and active acceptance. Passive acceptance, an example of this is saying whatever happens, happens. We're not going to do anything about it. We'll just absorb it. But active acceptance is putting aside some form of contingency, which could be a monetary contingency. It could also be a resource contingency. It could also be a schedule buffer. So if this risk happens, then we have this buffer or we have this contingency to deal with the risk. So be aware of passive and active acceptance. The next tool and technique here is strategies for opportunities. Again, the first thing you could do is escalate. If it's beyond what the project manager or the sponsor could make happen, needs to be escalated. If it's outside the realm of the project and hey, there's a positive opportunity that could affect the organization in a massive way, it could make the organization become a totally new entity in a good way. Could put them on the map, it could bring in huge revenues. Then we want to make sure we escalate that to management, escalate it to the right level. Still under strategies for opportunities, if you find an opportunity on a project, you could exploit the opportunity. To exploit the opportunity means you're doing everything possible to ensure that that risk does occur. In other words, you are eliminating the possibility of that risk not occurring. You are making sure 100% that that risk absolutely does occur. We call that exploiting the risk. The next one under this topic is sharing the risk, sharing ownership of the risk. It could be 70-30 with a third party. It could be even 0 for you and 100% for the other entity. It's giving some or all of the opportunity to a third party to reap the benefits. The next one is called enhance. The enhance strategy is used to increase the probability and or the impact of a particular upside risk. So while you're not doing everything under the sun to make it happen like you would in exploit, you're increasing the probability and or the impact. The final one here under strategies for opportunities is accept, and this refers to accepting an opportunity, saying if it happens, it happens, but you're not going to do anything to actively pursue it. If it comes, it comes. No proactive action is taken. It's pretty much if it falls on our lap, it does. If it doesn't, no big deal. Under this topic, we also have passive acceptance, taking no proactive action whatsoever. And then we can have active acceptance, putting aside a contingency reserve of one type or another to deal with the positive risk if it does occur. So those are strategies for opportunities. Our next one here, next tool and technique is contingent response strategies. Now, some responses are designed for use only if certain events occur. For example, you could say, if this risk occurs, then we will do this. If we see that this trigger, which by the way is a warning sign that a risk is about to occur, if this trigger happens, then we'll do this. So events that trigger the contingency response could be missing a milestone or gaining higher priority with a seller. We want to identify those triggers and track them so that when they occur, it gives us a warning sign that we need to take some certain action identified as a contingency plan or a fallback plan. Now be aware that these terms, contingency plan and fallback plan, are used interchangeably in the world of the PMI. When you hear the term fallback plan, bear in mind that it's plan B. It's planned in advance. Now there's a term that is often mixed with contingency plan and fallback plan, and this term is called workaround. A workaround is not a fallback plan or a contingency plan. A workaround is a response to a risk that was not conceived of at the time the risk occurred. A fallback plan is conceived before the risk occurs. So at the time the risk occurs, if you don't have a plan and you're scrambling around looking for what to do, we call that a workaround. Our next tool and technique is strategies for overall project risks. Now, when you hear strategies for overall project risks, folks, bear in mind that these are very similar to what we have already discussed. In fact, they have pretty much the same names, but it's the scale and the level at which they're done that makes them a bit different. So when you think about strategies for overall project risks, the terms are pretty much the same. Let's talk about them one by one. Avoid. What do we mean by avoid? So what do we do at the project level when we avoid a risk? To avoid a risk at the project level, you could cut out the scope, or you could also cancel the project. We could also exploit a risk. We could decide to add additional scope to harvest the risk. We could add additional value to the benefit of stakeholders in a project. We could also transfer a benefit or a concern that's found, sharing the risk, so we could transfer or share with a third party. We could mitigate or enhance risks at the project level, and we can accept risks at the project level. Now, the PMI has given some examples of these, and again, I would like you to read this up in detail because I don't want to read aloud to you. So go to 11.5.2.7, pause the video for some, and read up about these strategies for overall project risks. These are likely to help your exam experience. The final tool and technique is called decision making. We could use multi-criteria decision analysis, using multiple criteria to establish the line of action to be taken. We could use a voting process. We could use a decision matrix. There are all sorts of approaches to decision making. Let's take a look at our outputs here. The first one is change requests. There could be a change to the cost and schedule baselines on a project. The next output is project management plan updates, and this refers to any updates to the project management plan. There could be a wide variety of updates. Of course, the risk management plan could be updated at this point because there's still stuff to be done. Mysteriously, it is not mentioned in the bullets, but be aware that it could be updated. And finally, we have project documents updates. Project documents such as the assumptions log, the lessons learned register, very important one, and more could be updated as a result of this process. Be aware that the risk register is the big one, but a lot of other documents could also be updated. And that concludes the plan risk responses process.